close your eyes for just a moment and listen. Somewhere beneath the grey and restless surface of the North Sea, the world is very old. The wind has always moved this way, cold, indifferent, carrying salt. And long before the age of maps, long before any empire thought to name these waters, small wooden ships emerged from the mist, their carved prows cutting the horizon like a blade through silence. They did not ask for permission from the world. They simply arrived. This is the story of the Vikings, not quite the story you have been told before. Not the horned helmets, not the bloodthirsty caricature, not the simplification of a people so vast and layered that historians are still, to this very day, quietly unraveling the threads of their lives. This is the full story. The patient one, the one told at the pace the sea demands. We begin, as all good things do, slowly. The word itself, Viking, is worth pausing on. It did not mean what most people assume. It was not a name for a people. It was not a tribe, not a nation, not a bloodline. The word, rooted in the Old Norse Vikingr, referred to an act, the act of going out, of departure, of seeking. A Viking was someone who went on a voyage, and in that departure became something greater than what they were before they left. The peoples of Scandinavia, the Danes, the Norwegians, the Swedes, they did not call themselves Vikings when they sat at their hearths, when they farmed their narrow strips of land between mountain and fjord, when they raised their children and buried their dead. They became Vikings when they sailed. And so the very name contains, hidden inside it, the truth of who they really were. A people defined not by where they came from, but by where they were willing to go. They emerged from the northern edges of the known world, from Norway's cathedral of fjords, from the flat and windswept coast of Denmark, from the vast Swedish forests that seemed, to southern eyes, to go on forever. This was a hard land, a land that produced hard people, not through cruelty, but through the slow and patient discipline of survival. The growing season was short. The winters were long and dark in a way that people further south could not quite imagine, a darkness so complete and so prolonged that it became, for the Norse people, something almost sacred, something to be endured, and in the enduring, honored. They built their societies around this endurance. They built their longhouses low against the ground, as if taking shelter from something larger than themselves. They gathered close to fire. They told stories, and the stories they told were magnificent, wild, fatalistic, achingly beautiful. Stories of gods who would one day die, of a world that would end and be reborn, of honor that mattered more than survival. These were not the stories of a people who feared the dark. These were the stories of a people who had made their peace with it. And then, one summer, a summer now fixed permanently in the Western imagination, they sailed south. The year was 793. The place was a small, quiet island monastery off the northeastern coast of England, a place called Lindisfarne, known then as the Holy Island. The monks who lived there were scholars and keepers of light, men who had dedicated their lives to illuminating manuscripts in the long, contemplative hours before dawn. On a June morning, ships appeared on the water. The monks would not have known what they were looking at. Nothing in their experience had prepared them for this. The ships came fast, faster than anything they had seen, and from them poured men who fought with a ferocity that seemed, to the terrified witnesses, less than human and more than animal. Supernatural. Sent, perhaps, as punishment. The chronicles of that day were written in a kind of stunned disbelief. One monk wrote simply that it had never before been seen in all of Britain that such a terror had come from the sea. It had not, but it would come again, and again, and again. What followed was not merely a series of raids. What followed was one of the most consequential migrations and cultural expansions in human history. The Vikings did not simply terrorize the coastlines of Europe and retreat back to the darkness from which they came. They settled, they traded, they negotiated, they married into the communities they had once attacked. They founded cities. Dublin, one of Europe's great capitals today, was a Viking settlement. They sailed west across the open Atlantic, across an ocean with no landmarks, guided only by the stars and the behavior of birds and the color of the water. And they found Iceland. Then Greenland. Then, 500 years before Columbus raised a flag on a Caribbean beach, a Norse explorer named Leif Erikson stood on the coast of North America and called it Vinland, the land of vines. They pressed east as well, down the river systems of what is now Russia, through a landscape of birch forests and frozen silence, trading as far south as Constantinople and Baghdad. The Arabic geographer Ibn Fadlan met a group of Norse traders on the Volga River in the year 922 and left behind one of the most extraordinary eyewitness accounts of the Viking Age, a description of their physical presence, their customs, their rituals, written by a man who was clearly both fascinated and unsettled by everything he saw. They were not one thing. That is perhaps the most important and the most easily forgotten truth about them. They were farmers who became warriors. They were warriors who became merchants. They were merchants who became settlers. They were settlers who became, over generations, entirely new peoples. Norman in France, Russian along the Volga, Irish in Dublin, English in York. They absorbed the cultures around them, even as they changed those cultures beyond recognition. And through it all, beneath every transformation, something persisted. A quality that is difficult to name precisely, but which you recognize immediately when you encounter it. A forward-facing quality. A refusal to remain still. An almost physical restlessness. A need to know what lay beyond the next headland, the next river bend, the next horizon. They were, in the deepest sense, seekers. And it is that quality, more than the raids, more than the battles, more than the sagas, that made them legendary. Not simply in their own time, but in every time that followed. Because the story of the Vikings is not a story that ends. It is a story that keeps arriving, again and again, on shores that thought they had seen everything. Their ships are still coming over the horizon. We have barely begun to watch. To understand the Vikings, you must first understand the land that made them. Not as an abstraction, not as a backdrop, but as a living, breathing force. As present and as demanding as any god they ever worshipped. Because the landscape of Scandinavia did not merely surround these people, it shaped them at the cellular level in ways that would echo outward across centuries and continents. You cannot separate the Norse warrior from the Norwegian fjord any more than you can separate a river from the valley it carved. The one created the other. The one is always, in some essential way, the other. Stand, if you can, at the edge of a Norwegian fjord in late October. The light is already thinning. The mountains on either side rise so steeply from the water that they seem less like geological features and more like walls, as though the earth itself has closed in around this narrow strip of dark, mirror-still water, and the sky above is simply a corridor between two impossible heights. The silence is not the absence of sound. It is its own kind of sound, dense, layered, faintly alive. The water below you is so cold and so clear that you can see, several meters down, the slow movement of the bottom. And you stand there, and you feel, most people feel it immediately, without being able to name it, a kind of pressure, a magnificent, humbling smallness. The Norse people felt this every day of their lives, and it did not break them, it built them. The geography of Scandinavia is not generous. This is the first and most foundational thing to understand. The Norwegian coastline, the longest and most dramatically fractured coastline in the world, offered its inhabitants very little in the way of flat, arable land. The fjords are beautiful beyond language, But beauty does not feed a family through February. The usable farmland in Norway sits in narrow ribbons along the valley floors, squeezed between granite and water, and for centuries these small parcels of earth were divided and subdivided among sons, until the portions became almost absurdly small, too small, in many cases, to sustain a household. Denmark, by contrast, was flatter, its soil darker and more willing, but it too was a land of coasts and islands. A land where the sea was never truly absent from daily life, always visible, always audible, always present at the edge of everything. And Sweden, vast, forested Sweden, offered its people timber and iron and furs, but demanded in return a physical toughness that the landscape enforced simply by existing. To live in these places was to negotiate, constantly, with conditions that did not care whether you survived. The cold was not a season, it was a relationship. It demanded respect, preparation, and a particular kind of mental fortitude that, once developed, expressed itself in everything. In the architecture of the longhouse, in the design of the ship, in the structure of the society, in the stories told around the fire when the snow outside made the walls creak, and the light inside the hall seemed like the only warm thing left in the entire world. The sea, then, was not an obstacle. It was a corridor. This is a distinction that changes everything, and it is one that people who did not grow up beside the sea often struggle to grasp. For inland peoples, water has historically been a barrier, something to cross, something to fear, something that interrupts the natural movement of armies and goods and ideas. But for the Norse people, the sea was the road. It was the easiest road, the fastest road, the road that required no clearing of forest, no filling of bog, no negotiation with the mountain. You simply pushed the boat out and went where the water took you, or where the wind agreed to carry you, or where you were skilled enough to navigate against both. And they were extraordinarily skilled. This cannot be overstated. The Viking longship is one of the most elegant engineering solutions in human history. A vessel so perfectly suited to its purpose that it has never truly been improved upon for what it was designed to do. It was shallow enough to be navigated up rivers that would ground any ship of comparable size, flexible enough in its construction that it could flex with the movement of heavy ocean swells rather than breaking against them, light enough to be carried over land between river systems, and fast enough under sail or oar to outrun almost anything the 9th or 10th century could put on the water against it. The clinker construction, the overlapping planks of oak, each one carefully shaped and fitted, riveted together with iron and corked with wool or animal hair, gave the hull a kind of living flexibility that modern shipbuilders still study with genuine admiration. These ships were not built to conquer the sea. They were built to move with it, to cooperate with it, and that cooperation, that deep, technical and almost philosophical understanding of water, was itself a product of generations of observation, of watching the way the fjord behaved in different winds, of reading the color of open ocean, of knowing what the birds flying in a particular direction at a particular hour of the evening actually meant about the location of land. Navigation, for the Norse sailor, was a sensory skill as much as a mathematical one. They read the stars, yes, but they also read the swell patterns beneath the keel, the temperature of the water against a trailing hand, the behavior of sea creatures, the smell of the air. There is evidence, compelling, careful, scholarly evidence, that they may have used a crystal called Iceland spar as a kind of solar compass, capable of locating the position of the sun even through overcast skies by polarizing light. Whether or not this is definitively proven, the underlying truth it points toward is not in doubt. These were people of extraordinary observational intelligence. Their world was full of information, and they had learned, over many lifetimes, how to read it. But we must be careful here not to reduce them to their practicality, because the Norse people were not merely practical. They were something far more interesting than that. They were deeply, almost ferociously spiritual, inhabitants of a mythological universe, so rich and so internally consistent, so populated with meaning and symbol and consequence that it shaped every aspect of daily life in ways both visible and invisible. Their cosmos was called Yggdrasil, the world tree, an immense ash tree at the center of everything, its roots reaching down into 9 separate worlds, its branches holding up the sky, its trunk threading through the middle realm of Midgard, where human beings lived their brief and consequential lives. This was not merely a story. This was a map of how reality was organized, of what forces were in play at any given moment, of what the obligations of a human life actually were. The gods of Asgard, Odin, Thor, Freya, Tyr, Loki, and the many others, were not distant or abstract. They were present. They were active. They bled, they argued. They made mistakes and suffered consequences. They loved and lost and occasionally behaved in ways that were, by any reasonable standard, deeply undignified. This was, in fact, one of the most remarkable things about Norse mythology. Its gods were mortal, not immortal beings temporarily inconvenienced by human affairs, but genuinely mortal, subject to fate, bound by prophecy, destined, every one of them, to die at Ragnarok, the great final battle at the end of time. Odin, the All-Father, the Lord of Asgard, the god of wisdom and war and poetry. Odin himself would be swallowed by the wolf Fenrir when the last day came. Thor, beloved Thor, slayer of giants and protector of humanity, would kill the Midgard serpent at Ragnarok and then walk 9 steps and fall. 9 steps. The mythmakers counted them. What does it mean to worship gods who will die? It means you live in a universe where courage is not merely admirable, it is cosmically necessary, where the act of facing overwhelming force with dignity and resolve is not just a human virtue, but a divine one. The gods themselves modeled it. Odin hung himself on Yggdrasil for 9 days and 9 nights, wounded by a spear, staring into the darkness below in order to win the knowledge of the runes. He sacrificed his eye at the well of Mimir in exchange for wisdom. He chose suffering as a path to understanding. And from this, the Norse warrior drew a simple and devastating conclusion. There is no shame in the difficulty of things. There is only shame in refusing to meet the difficulty. This is where the famous Norse acceptance of fate, the concept of word, the woven thread of destiny, reveals its true texture. It was not passivity. It was the opposite of passivity. It was the understanding that certain outcomes cannot be changed, and that within that fixed frame, how you conduct yourself is the only thing that truly belongs to you. The battlefield, the storm, the long winter, these things would come regardless. What you brought to them was your own, and what you brought to them would be remembered or forgotten. And that distinction mattered more than survival itself. The Norse concept of afterlife reinforced all of this. Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, is perhaps the most famous, but it was not the only destination available to the Norse dead, and the popular image of it requires some quiet correction. Valhalla was not simply a reward for dying in battle. It was the home of those chosen by Odin's Valkyries, the warrior women who moved through the chaos of combat and selected the most worthy of the fallen, not merely the most fierce, but the most exemplary. To be chosen was an honor of the highest order, not a guarantee. And those who arrived in Valhalla did not simply feast for eternity. They fought each day, dying and being restored, preparing. Odin made this explicit. For the final battle of Ragnarok, even paradise was purposeful. Even rest was preparation. Those not chosen by the Valkyries went to hell, not the Christian hell of punishment, but a quieter place, a grey and muted realm ruled by the goddess Hel herself, where the dead lived in a diminished version of existence. The Norse did not regard this as particularly terrible. It was simply what came after. What mattered was not avoiding death. Death was unavoidable, even for the gods. but what you had done before it arrived, what you had built, what you had said, what people would tell about you when you were gone. The sagas. The great prose narratives that the Norse composed and passed down through the centuries were themselves a form of immortality. To be remembered in a saga was to live forever in the only way that mattered. And so the Norse people were, in a very real sense, writing their own afterlives every day of their living ones, through acts of courage, through generosity to their kin, through skill in craft or battle or seamanship, through the quality of their word, through the consistency of their honor. The longhouse, the ship, the farm. These were the stages on which that daily writing occurred. And so when we returned finally to the image of those ships on the horizon, those carved prows emerging from the morning mist, we can see them now with different eyes. These were not simply raiders. They were men shaped by a land that offered very little and demanded a great deal, sailing vessels of astonishing sophistication, guided by a navigational intelligence built across generations of patient observation, animated by a mythological worldview that made courage not merely desirable but cosmically necessary, and conscious, in a way that perhaps no other culture of their era was quite so explicitly conscious, that how they lived would determine how they were remembered. They were, in the fullest sense of the phrase, intentional people. Everything they did, the raids, the trading expeditions, the settlements, the exploration, everything emerged from this same deep foundation, from the land that built them, from the sea that opened the world to them, from the stories that told them who they were supposed to be. The world they came from was cold and difficult and dark for half the year, and from that darkness they brought fire. There is a particular quality to the silence just before dawn on the Northumbrian coast. The sea pulls back from the shore with a slow, whispering exhaust. The sound of water releasing its grip on stone, and the sky above holds a darkness that is not quite black anymore, not quite anything yet. A color without a name that belongs only to that suspended moment between night and morning. The gulls have not yet started. The fishing boats sit still in the harbor. The world is, for a few minutes, genuinely at rest. It was into silences like this one that the Viking ships arrived. Not with drums, not with war cries, not with any of the theatrical forewarning that later legend would generously supply. They came quietly, in the dark, because quiet and dark were advantages that a skilled commander exploited without sentiment. The longship, running under oar in the final approach, made almost no sound, the shallow draft barely disturbing the water's surface, the oars moving in a disciplined, practiced rhythm developed over years of seamanship until it became unconscious, mechanical, as natural as breathing. The men aboard would have been awake for hours, cold, focused, their bodies held in the particular stillness of people who know that what comes next will require everything. And then the keel touched the shore, and the silence ended. The raid on Lindisfarne in 793 did not come from nowhere, though it felt that way to those who experienced it. History rarely arrives without context, and the Viking Age, which that raid effectively announced to a horrified European world, had been building quietly for decades, shaped by pressures both internal and external that most contemporary observers were simply not positioned to see. Scandinavia, in the late 8th century, was a region under considerable strain. Populations had grown faster than the available agricultural land could support, particularly in Norway, where the fjord topography placed such firm physical limits on expansion. The inheritance customs of the Norse, where land was divided among sons rather than passed intact to the eldest, had, over several generations, produced parcels of farmland too small to sustain a family with any real security. Younger sons, in particular, found themselves in an increasingly uncomfortable position, raised with the expectations and the pride of freemen, of carls. but without the land or the resources to fulfill those expectations in the traditional way. The sea, then, was not merely an option. For many of these men, it was the only option. At the same time, the political landscape to the south was shifting in ways that both created opportunity and, arguably, contributed to the urgency of Norse expansion. The Frankish Empire under Charlemagne was in the process of absorbing and Christianizing the Saxon peoples of what is now northern Germany, a process that was, in some areas, conducted with considerable violence. The Saxons were neighbors and, in some cases, trading partners of the Danes. The Frankish expansion northward was not an abstraction to the Norse. It was a geopolitical development of immediate and personal relevance, and Charlemagne's court, for its part, was well aware that the peoples to the north watched their expansion with a clear-eyed wariness that was not quite hostility, but was not quite peace either. There are records of Charlemagne ordering the construction of a coastal watch, of sending ships to patrol the Frisian coast, of expressing, in terms that suggest genuine unease, his concern about what the Northmen might eventually do. He was right to be concerned, but he did not live to see the full extent of it. Lindisfarne, in the summer of 793, was an almost absurdly attractive target. The Holy Island sat just off the Northumbrian coast, separated from the mainland by a narrow tidal causeway that made it simultaneously accessible and isolated. Accessible enough for pilgrims and traders, isolated enough that its monks felt the security of separation from the more dangerous currents of the wider world. The monastery had been founded in 634 by the Irish monk Aidan, and in the century and a half since, it had grown into one of the most important centers of Christian scholarship in northern Europe, the Lindisfarne Gospels. That extraordinary illuminated manuscript, arguably one of the most beautiful books ever made by human hands, had been created here in these stone buildings by monks who devoted years of their lives to the patient perfection of each decorated page. And the monastery was wealthy. Wealthy in the way the religious institutions of the early medieval period accumulated wealth, through donations of land, through the gifts of pilgrims, through the accumulated offerings of the faithful who came from across Britain and Ireland, and even from the continent to pray at the shrine of St. Cuthbert, the beloved northern saint whose relics were kept here. Gold and silver altar vessels, embroidered vestments, jeweled book covers, the concentrated, portable, eminently seizable wealth of a community that had never had reason to fear what was coming from the sea. The attack was swift, targeted, and utterly devastating. The monks, scholars, copyists, elderly men given to contemplation, had no meaningful capacity for resistance. Some were killed, others were captured, their fates bound to whatever the slave markets of Scandinavia would eventually decide. The monastery was stripped, and then the ships were gone, as quickly as they had come, vanishing back into the North Sea before any organized response was possible. The entire event, from the beaching of the longships to their departure, may have taken only a few hours. But its impact would last for centuries. The scholar Alcuin of York, one of the great intellectual figures of Charlemagne's court, wrote about the attack in terms of barely contained horror and theological bewilderment. He framed it as divine punishment. What sins, he asked, had the people of Northumbria committed to deserve such a visitation? And his letter, preserved across the centuries, captures something important about the psychological effect of Lindisfarne that went far beyond the immediate losses. What the attack did, more than anything else, was shatter a conceptual certainty. The sea, which Christians of the North Atlantic Rim had understood as essentially benign, a medium for trade, for pilgrimage, for the slow movement of faith and learning from one holy place to another, had suddenly, violently, become something else, a source of danger, an opening through which the world's most frightening possibilities could pour. This was not merely fear. This was a reorganization of the imagination, and it took decades. in some places, generations, for the coastal communities of Britain, Ireland, and France to find any kind of settled accommodation with the new reality. In the immediate aftermath of Lindisfarne, the raids continued. Monasteries, it turned out, were excellent targets, not just for their wealth but for their location. They were almost invariably built near water, because water was the medieval road, and so the same geography that made them accessible to pilgrims made them accessible to raiders. Jarrow was hit in 794. Iona, that most sacred of islands where Columba had built his monastery and from which Christianity had spread across much of Scotland, was attacked in 795, and again in 82, and again in 86, when 68 of the community's monks were killed on the beach at a place now known, with quiet and permanent accuracy, as Martyrs Bay. The pattern of these early raids reveals something important about the tactical sophistication of those conducting them. These were not random acts of opportunistic violence. They were planned, reconnoitered, intelligently targeted operations carried out by men who understood the geography of the coastline, the rhythms of ecclesiastical life, and the organizational limitations of the kingdoms they were attacking. The Norse had traders and scouts moving through these regions before the raiders arrived. Information about the wealth of specific monasteries, the defensibility of specific harbors, the response times of local lords. This was gathered, considered, and used. When a ship appeared on the horizon off the coast of Iona, it was not there by accident. But the raids were, in a sense, only the opening movement of a far longer and more complex composition. Through the first decades of the 9th century, the nature of Norse activity in Britain and Ireland began to shift. Gradually at first, then with increasing speed and confidence, from seasonal raiding to something more deliberate, more permanent, and more transformative. The turning point, historians generally agree, came in the 830s and 840s when the Norse, predominantly Danish forces in England and Irish waters, Norwegian in Scotland and the North Atlantic, began overwintering. Instead of sailing home at the end of the raiding season, they stayed. They built fortified camps on islands and riverbanks, protected positions from which they could operate year-round. In Ireland, these camps were called long forts, literally ship harbors, and they were the embryonic forms of what would eventually become permanent settlements. Dublin, which would grow into one of medieval Europe's busiest and most prosperous cities, began as one of these long forts on the banks of the Liffey. The decision to overwinter was not simply a tactical choice. It was a statement of intent. It said, in the plainest possible terms, we are not merely visiting. And the communities of Britain and Ireland, already struggling to formulate any coherent response to the raids, now faced something categorically more challenging. Not an annual emergency to be endured and recovered from, but a sustained, organized territorial presence that needed to be negotiated with, bought off, fought, or accommodated. The great heathen army of 865 represents the apex of this escalation, and it deserves to be understood in its full and extraordinary dimensions. In the autumn of that year, a force that the Anglo-Saxon chronicles described with a kind of stunned understatement, simply as "Mysel Harthen here," the great heathen army, landed in East Anglia and began what would become a decade-long campaign of conquest across the kingdoms of England. The scale of this force was unlike anything that had come before. This was not a raiding party. This was an invasion army, structured and commanded with the kind of strategic coherence that suggests significant planning and a clearly articulated long-term objective. Modern estimates of its size vary, figures of several thousand, to perhaps as many as 5,000 fighting men have been proposed, which, in the context of 9th century England, represented an overwhelming military force. Its leadership was drawn from the most formidable family in the Viking Age. The army was commanded, according to later Norse tradition, and a growing body of historical scholarship by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, a figure so mythologized that separating the historical man from the legendary one has become one of the more entertaining puzzles of early medieval studies. Whether or not the historical Ragnar was quite what the sagas made him, his sons were real and they were formidable. Halfdan Ragnarsson, Ivar, known with a name that has never lost its chill as Ivar the Boneless. Ubba. These were men of considerable political and military intelligence, and the campaign they conducted was not a rampage. It was a chess game played on a board the size of England, and for the better part of a decade, they played it with extraordinary skill. They moved through the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms with a strategic patience that must have been deeply unnerving to their opponents. They took York in 866, Jorvik as they called it, the great northern city, and made it the capital of what would become the Danelaw, that substantial portion of England that would live for decades under Norse law and Norse custom. They defeated and killed Edmund, King of East Anglia, in 869, an act that gave Christianity one of its most celebrated English martyrs and gave the Danes control of the entire eastern seaboard. They drove deep into Mercia. They threatened Wessex, and it was in Wessex that they finally found something they had not encountered in sufficient strength elsewhere: organized, intelligent, sustained resistance. His name was Alfred. He was 21 years old when he became King of Wessex in 871, inheriting a kingdom under enormous military pressure, and he would spend the better part of the next 30 years fighting, not just militarily, but administratively, intellectually, culturally, to preserve English civilization from absorption. The story of Alfred and the Danes is one of the great stories of the early medieval period, and we will give it the full attention it deserves in a later chapter. But it is worth pausing on it here, briefly, because it illuminates something important about the nature of the Viking Age, that the raids alone do not quite convey. The great heathen army was not defeated, ultimately, by superior force. Alfred could not match the Danes soldier for soldier. No Anglo-Saxon king of this period could. What Alfred did was something more subtle and more lasting. He built a network of fortified towns, burza, across Wessex, positioned so that no point in the kingdom was more than a day's march from a defended position, and manned them with the systematic obligation of his subjects' military service. He built ships, the first English navy, rudimentary by Norse standards but sufficient to begin contesting control of the coastal waters. He negotiated, shrewdly and without illusion, the Treaty of Wedmore in 886, which formally divided England between the Danelaw in the north and east and the English kingdoms of the south and west. And he built institutions, schools, a system of law, a tradition of vernacular scholarship that gave the English people a cultural identity robust enough to survive the next century of pressure. The Viking Age in England did not end with a great heathen army. It continued in various forms for another 150 years, but the failure of the Danes to absorb Wessex marked a turning point. The point at which the story ceased to be about conquest and began to be about the slow, complicated, frequently violent process of integration. The Danelaw was not a foreign country imposed on an unwilling population. It was a region where Norse and English cultures mingled, traded, intermarried, argued, and gradually merged into something new. Place names across northern and eastern England still carry the evidence of this. Every village ending in by or thorp or thwaite is, in its name, a piece of fossilized Norse, a linguistic remnant of a world where two cultures occupied the same fields and eventually stopped seeing each other as strangers. Across the Irish Sea, the story unfolded along different but equally complex lines. The Norse engagement with Ireland was, from the beginning, a more tangled and ambiguous affair than the relatively clear-cut territorial ambitions of the great heathen army in England. Ireland in the early 9th century was a patchwork of small kingdoms in a state of near constant internal conflict, a political landscape that the Norse initially exploited with great effectiveness, allying with one Irish king against another, accepting payment to fight other people's wars, and gradually establishing their coastal settlements as functioning commercial hubs rather than simply military positions. Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Limerick. These were all Norse foundations, and they functioned primarily as trading towns, drawing goods from the Irish hinterland and connecting Ireland to the wider Norse commercial network that stretched from the Arctic to the Mediterranean. The relationship between the Norse settlers and the native Irish was, from very early on, a negotiated one. Difficult, frequently violent, occasionally warm, always complicated. Norse chieftains accepted Christianity relatively quickly in Ireland, often within a generation or two of settlement. Their children and grandchildren had Irish names alongside Norse ones, spoke both languages, worshipped at Irish monasteries while maintaining their own cultural traditions. The Gael, the foreign Irish, or the Gaelic Norse, were a recognized social category by the late 9th century. People of mixed heritage who belonged fully to neither world and had, in their ambiguity, created a third one. This pattern of Norse raiders becoming Norse settlers becoming something genuinely new, neither fully Norse nor fully native, would repeat itself across every region the Vikings touched, with variations determined by local conditions. It is one of the most consistent and most underappreciated facts of the Viking Age, that wherever the Norse established themselves for more than a generation, they changed the place, and the place changed them, and the result was always something that had not previously existed in the world. To the south, the rivers of France opened like invitations. The Seine, the Loire, the Garonne. These great river systems penetrated hundreds of miles into the Frankish heartland, and to the Norse eye, trained to read waterways as roads, they were exactly that. From the late 800s onward, Norse fleets began moving up the French rivers with a confidence that the Frankish defenses, designed for a different kind of warfare, were simply not equipped to counter. Paris was attacked, with devastating effect. In 845, when a fleet commanded by a Norse chieftain known in the Frankish sources as Ragnar sailed up the Seine with approximately 5,000 men and 120 ships, bypassed the Frankish forces arrayed against him on one bank by crossing to the other, and arrived at the walls of Paris in the Easter week of that year. The Frankish king, Charles the Bald, paid 7,000 pounds of silver, ransomed from the coffers of the church and the royal treasury, to make the fleet go away. And the fleet went away. But the precedent had been set, and it was one that would be exploited repeatedly over the following decades. The Danes learned what the British had also, painfully, learned, that the Frankish kingdoms, for all their organizational sophistication and military strength, struggled fundamentally with the problem of mobile naval forces operating deep inland. The longship had given its builders a strategic advantage that no amount of cavalry or fortified positions could entirely negate, because the longship could be where you did not expect it and could be gone before you responded. The climax of the Norse engagement with France came in 886, when a force of some 30,000 men and 700 ships, numbers that, even accounting for medieval chroniclers' tendency toward exaggeration, still represent an enormous force, besieged Paris for nearly a year. The defense of the city, led by the remarkable Count Odo of Paris and the Bishop Goslin, became one of the celebrated military stands of the early medieval period. A siege conducted with ingenuity and courage by a garrison vastly outnumbered and without the prospect of timely relief. The Viking force, for its part, demonstrated a sophistication in siege warfare. Siege engines, battering rams, attempts to fireship the bridges. That somewhat complicates the popular image of Norse warriors as purely mobile raiders incapable of sustained positional military operations. Paris held. The siege was eventually ended not by military defeat but by negotiation. The new Frankish king, Charles the Fat, paid the Norse forces to redirect their attention to Burgundy, a decision that outraged contemporaries and helped, the following year, to cost him his throne. But the more significant long-term consequence of the Norse presence in France was not the sieges or the river raids. It was a settlement. In 911, a Norse chieftain named Rollo, a man of Norwegian origin who had spent years raiding in the Seine Valley, a man physically described in later sources as so large that no horse could bear his weight, a man of evident political intelligence beneath the warrior exterior, sat down with the Frankish king Charles the Simple and negotiated the Treaty of St. Clair. Sir, Epte, under the terms of this agreement, Rollo and his followers received formal recognition of their control over the territory at the mouth of the Seine, the territory that would take its name from them and be known from that day forward as Normandy, the land of the Northmen. In exchange, Rollo accepted Christian baptism, swore fealty to the Frankish king, and agreed to defend the Seine estuary against further Norse incursions from the sea. It is, in miniature, the entire story of the Viking Age, a people who arrived as raiders, who made themselves indispensable through their military capacity, who converted, gradually, with varying degrees of conviction, to the faith of the people they had initially terrorized, who intermarried with the local population and absorbed the local language and adapted the local institutions to their own purposes, who in a single or perhaps 2 generations became so thoroughly integrated that they were no longer recognizably Norse at all. Rollo's great-great-great-grandson was William, Duke of Normandy. In 1066, William crossed the Channel and conquered England. The man who decisively ended the Viking Age in England was, by direct descent, a Viking. The circle, when you trace it fully, is extraordinary. And yet, through all of this, through the raids and the rivers, the sieges and the settlements, the ransoms paid and the treaties signed and the kingdoms carved up and redistributed, through all of it, there ran a consistent human thread that the great political and military narratives tend to obscure. Most of the men on those ships were not chieftains or commanders. They were farmers' sons and fishermen's sons, and the younger brothers of men who would inherit whatever small portion of rocky Norwegian hillside their father had managed to hold together. They were men who had calculated, not always consciously, not always in the terms that historians would later use to describe their decisions, but calculated nonetheless that the risk of sailing into the unknown was preferable to the certainty of remaining in a world that had no room for them. They were men who had listened, since childhood, to stories of the gods who faced oblivion without flinching, and had drawn from those stories the entirely logical conclusion that a life without boldness was already a kind of death. They were frightening, yes, to the monks of Lindisfarne, to the merchants of Paris, to the farmers of Kent and Munster and Brittany who woke one morning to the sound of ships on the river. They were as frightening as anything the early medieval world could produce. But they were also, beneath the fear they inspired, recognizably and entirely human, ambitious and frightened and homesick and cold and motivated by the same desires that have animated every migration in human history, the desire for land, for security, for the possibility of something better, for the chance to be, in whatever terms their culture offered, remembered. The longships came out of the morning mist and changed the world, and the men aboard them, for all their ferocity, were men who wanted what most people want: a place, a name, a story worth telling. They found all three. There is a merchant in the marketplace of Hedeby in the year 850 who has not raided anything in his life. He is perhaps 40 years old, which in the 9th century makes him a man of considerable experience and, if he has survived this long in his profession, considerable shrewdness. He has calloused hands and a weathered face, but the calluses come from rope and oar rather than from sword and shield. His ship, moored in the harbour behind the market stalls, is broader in the beam than a longship, deeper in the draught, slower. and carrying, at this moment, a cargo that includes walrus ivory from the Arctic, amber from the Baltic coast, Frankish wine in sealed ceramic jugs, bolts of wool dyed in colors that will not be available further east for another 2 weeks, and 3 slaves, a Frankish man, an Irish woman, and a boy of indeterminate origin, whose lives he regards with the same practical detachment that he applies to the amber and the wine. He is not a good man by any reasonable modern standard, but he is a precise and accurate picture of something that the popular image of the Viking Age almost entirely omits. He is the other half of the story, the half without the drama, without the raid, without the moment of arrival that reshapes a monastery's understanding of the world. He is the half that built the economic foundations upon which the entire Viking Age actually rested, and without which the longships and the warriors and the settlements would have had nothing to sustain them. He is a Norse trader, and his world was vast. Hedeby itself deserves a moment of attention, because it was, for much of the 9th and 10th centuries, one of the most important commercial nodes in northern Europe, and almost nobody outside the community of early medieval historians has heard of it. It sat at the base of the Jutland Peninsula, at the point where the river Schlei cuts inland from the Baltic coast, a position of almost geometrically perfect commercial advantage. From Hedeby, a trader could reach the North Sea to the west, the Baltic to the east, the Frankish kingdoms to the south, and the Scandinavian interior to the north, all within a reasonable sailing distance. The town itself, at its height, covered something in the region of 24 hectares and housed a population of perhaps 1,000 to 2,000 people, a substantial settlement for the period. Archaeological excavations have revealed a sophisticated urban environment, wooden plank roads surfaced against the mud, workshops for metalworking and comb cutting and glass bead production, a harbor infrastructure of jetties and warehouses, evidence of long-distance trade goods from as far afield as the Byzantine Empire and the Abbasid Caliphate. Hedeby was not unique. It was part of a network of similar trading towns, emporia, the historians call them, that the Norse established and maintained along the coastlines and river systems of their world. Birka in Sweden, on an island in Lake Mälaren, was another such place, and perhaps the most cosmopolitan of them all, a town where Byzantine silk and Arabic silver and Frankish glass existed alongside Norse domestic craft, in a daily commercial reality that quietly demolishes the idea of the early medieval world as a collection of isolated, inward-looking cultures. These were people who were deeply, structurally connected to a world much larger than their immediate neighborhood, and who had built, through generations of seafaring enterprise, the physical and commercial infrastructure to navigate that larger world with confidence. The Eastern trade routes were perhaps the most remarkable of all Norse commercial achievements, and they represent a chapter of Viking history so different from the Western raids that it can feel at first like a story about entirely different people. It begins, as so much of Norse history does, with rivers, the great river systems of what is now Russia. The Volga, the Dnieper, the Dvina, flow generally from north to south, connecting the Baltic coast to the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and therefore to the two greatest trading civilizations of the early medieval world, the Byzantine Empire, centered on Constantinople, and the Abbasid Caliphate, centered on Baghdad. The Norse, primarily Swedish in this eastern expansion, the people who would become known in the Slavic world as the Varangians, and who gave the emerging state of Russia its very name, Rus, derived from the Old Norse Roths, meaning the men who row, recognized the commercial potential of these routes with the same clear, practical intelligence that they applied to every geographical opportunity they encountered. The journey was not easy. It never was. The river route from the Baltic to Constantinople, known to later Norse and Byzantine sources as the route from the Varangians to the Greeks, involved sailing down the Gulf of Finland, across Lake Ladoga, down the Volkhov River to Lake Ilmen, and then south through a succession of rivers and portages to the Dnieper, which would carry you through the dangerous cataracts of its southern course to the Black Sea, and finally to the walls of Constantinople itself. The portages, those stretches where the river was unnavigable, or where you needed to cross overland from one river system to another, required the boats to be physically lifted from the water and carried, sometimes for significant distances, on the shoulders of their crews. It was brutal, exhausting work, and the cataracts of the lower Dnieper were actively dangerous, known to claim ships and men every season. But the rewards waiting at the end of the route made the difficulties worth calculating. Constantinople, in the 9th and 10th centuries, was the largest and richest city in the Western world. The population of the Byzantine capital has been estimated at perhaps 500,000 people, a scale almost incomprehensible to someone from Scandinavia, where the largest settlements numbered in the low thousands. The city was a concentrated expression of centuries of accumulated wealth and sophistication. Its markets offered goods from every corner of the known world. Its churches were sheathed in gold mosaic. Its imperial palace complex covered an area larger than many Norse towns, and its administrative and commercial infrastructure operated with a complexity and precision that would not be matched in Western Europe for centuries. The Norse traders who arrived at Constantinople, typically in the spring, their ships loaded with the high-value goods of the northern world, entered the city with a combination of awe and commercial determination that comes through clearly even in the dry, formal language of the Byzantine trade treaties that governed their activities. These treaties, two of which survive from 907 and 907 in 944, specified in careful detail the conditions under which the Rus traders could operate in the city. They were required to enter through a specific gate. They could stay in a designated quarter outside the city walls. They were entitled to free meals and bath facilities at Byzantine imperial expense, and they were permitted to trade duty-free, a privilege that speaks to how highly the Byzantines valued what the northern merchants brought. And what they brought was extraordinary in its own right. Furs, sable, marten, beaver, fox, in quantities and qualities that the Byzantine aristocracy found irresistible. Honey and beeswax, essential for both food and the candle requirements of the imperial church. Timber, always in demand in a city surrounded by water and largely stripped of local forest. And slaves, an enormous, continuous, shameful flow of enslaved people, predominantly Slavic in this eastern trade, captured in the forests and steppes of the Russian interior by Norse, led raiding parties and carried south to be sold in the markets of Constantinople and the Islamic world. The Norse word thrall entered the vocabulary of European languages as a word for slave, and the slave trade was, for much of the Viking Age, one of the most economically significant activities the Norse conducted. It is a dimension of Viking history that sits uncomfortably alongside the celebrated narratives of exploration and seamanship. But it belongs there in its full moral weight, because a history that omits it is a history that has chosen comfort over truth. In exchange for what they brought, the Rus traders took home Byzantine silk, that most prestigious of all early medieval luxury goods, as well as silver, glass, wine, spices, and the kind of cultural influences that do not show up in trade ledgers, but show up everywhere else, in the design of jewelry, in the adoption of new artistic motifs, in the slow absorption of Byzantine Christian culture that would eventually, through the Varangian presence in Russia, contribute to the conversion of Prince Vladimir of Kiev in 988 and the Christianization of the Russian world. The Volga route, running east rather than south, led eventually to the markets of the Abbasid Caliphate, a civilization that, at its 9th century height, was arguably the most intellectually and commercially sophisticated on earth. It was on the Volga, in 922, that the Arab diplomat and writer Ahmad ibn Fadlan encountered a group of Rus traders and recorded his observations in a document that remains one of the most vivid and irreplaceable eyewitness accounts of Norse people that history has left us. Ibn Fadlan was a man of considerable descriptive intelligence and, reading him carefully, considerable personal courage. He wrote about the Rus with an anthropological precision and a transparency about his own reactions that makes his account feel, even across 11 centuries, bracingly immediate. He described them as tall, fair, and tattooed from fingernail to neck with dark blue patterns, trees and figures and symbols whose exact meaning is still debated. He described their hygiene, which was more communal than Islamic convention approved of. They passed a single basin of water around for morning washing, and this offended him. He described their clothing, their weapons, their commercial customs, and he described at some length and with evident fascination and horror the elaborate funeral ritual he witnessed for a dead Rus chieftain, a ceremony involving the sacrifice of a slave woman, the burning of the chief's ship, and a ritual complexity that speaks to a religious life far richer and stranger than the simple warrior cult that later popular imagination would assign to the Norse. The Arabic silver that flowed northward along the Volga route has left its own extraordinary archaeological trace. Hordes of Arabic dirhams, silver coins minted in the Abbasid Caliphate and its successor states, have been found across Scandinavia, Russia, and the Baltic in their tens of thousands. The sheer volume of Arabic silver in the Norse world is staggering. It has been estimated that something in the order of 100 million dirhams flowed into Scandinavia through the eastern trade routes between roughly 800 and 1000 CE. This was not pocket change. This was the economic foundation of Norse society during the Viking Age. The silver that funded the ships, paid the warriors, built the towns, and expressed itself, eventually, in the spectacular jewelry and decorated metalwork that fills the glass cases of Scandinavian museums today. Westward, the Norse expansion into the North Atlantic represents a different kind of achievement entirely. One driven less by commercial calculation than by something harder to quantify, something closer to pure geographical curiosity, or perhaps to the simple Norse unwillingness to accept any horizon as final. Iceland was settled, according to the best available historical and genetic evidence, beginning around 870 CE. The island had been known to Irish monks, the Papa, as the Norse called them, for perhaps a century before the Norse arrived, and a handful of these hermit monks had made their way there in search of the kind of radical solitude that the increasingly populated coasts of Ireland could no longer provide. They found it, spectacularly, a landscape of volcanic desolation and almost supernatural beauty, glacier and geyser and midnight sun, entirely uninhabited by any permanent human population, offering to those with the courage and the practical intelligence to settle it a kind of radical freedom unavailable anywhere in the more crowded world to the east and south. The Norse settlers who followed, the land namsmen, the land takers, came primarily from Norway, many of them, according to the Land Namabok, the remarkable medieval Icelandic document that records the names and origins of the first settlers fleeing the consolidation of Norway under the expanding power of Harald Fairhair. Iceland offered them something that Norway, under a centralizing king, could no longer offer: land without a lord above it. The freedom to govern themselves, and govern themselves they did, establishing in 930 the Althing, a general assembly held annually at Thingvellir, where the representatives of Iceland's farming households gathered to legislate, adjudicate disputes, and conduct the political business of the community. The Althing is, by any reasonable definition, one of the oldest functioning parliaments in human history, and its existence in a Norse settlement at the far edge of the habitable world says something important about what the Norse carried with them when they sailed. Not just cargo and livestock and household goods, but a set of political instincts, a deep-seated preference for deliberative self-governance that expressed itself wherever they had the space to do so. From Iceland, the jump to Greenland was made around 985, led by a man named Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland for manslaughter, which was itself a not uncommon Norse biographical detail. who sailed west with a fleet of settlers and established two colonies on the southwestern coast of an island so vast and so extreme that it makes Iceland seem almost hospitable by comparison. The Greenlandic settlements endured, in various forms, for nearly 500 years, sustained by the same eastern trade routes in miniature, exporting walrus ivory and furs and live polar bears to the markets of Europe in exchange for the iron and timber that Greenland could not produce itself. And from Greenland, the final leap. Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailed west from Greenland around the year 1000 and made landfall on a coast that no European had previously reached. He called it Vinland, for the wild grapes, or perhaps wild berries, his crew found growing there. The archaeological site at Launcesey Oak Meadows in Newfoundland, confirmed by excavation in the 1960s and now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, establishes beyond any reasonable doubt that the Norse were in North America 5 centuries before Columbus. The site shows the remains of Norse-style turf buildings, a forge, iron rivets of Scandinavian type, and a bronze cloakpin. Small things, quiet things, but what they represent is almost too large to hold in the mind comfortably. The furthest reach of the most extensive pre-modern maritime expansion in human history, conducted by the descendants of farmers from the Norwegian fjords, navigating open ocean by stars and birds, and the color of the water, arriving on a continent they could not have known existed. The Norse did not hold Vinland. The indigenous peoples of North America, the Skraelings, as the Norse sources call them, resisted the settlement with a determination that the small Norse expeditionary forces could not overcome at such a distance from any support, and within a few years the attempt was abandoned. The continent waited 5 more centuries for its permanent European contact, but the attempt itself stands as the fullest expression of something that runs through every dimension of the Viking Age. From the Hedeby merchant counting his amber, to the Varangian trader in the markets of Constantinople, to Leif Erikson standing on a beach in Newfoundland, the Atlantic at his back and an unknown world spread out before him. The Norse were not, at their core, destroyers. They were, at their core, people who needed to know what was over the next horizon, and they built, across 3 centuries of restless, intelligent, dangerous, creative engagement with the wider world, a network of human connection, commercial, cultural, genetic, linguistic, that reached from Newfoundland to the banks of the Volga, from the Arctic ice to the markets of Baghdad, and that quietly, permanently, irreversibly changed the shape of the world they moved through. The raids are in the history books, but the trade routes, the settlements, the explored coastlines, and the founded cities, these are in the world itself, in the language you speak, in the place names on the maps, in the institutions that govern modern life, in the silver that still turns up heavy and cold and beautiful, in the earth of Swedish fields after a long rain. This is what the Norse left behind. Not just the memory of fire, but everything that came after it. Every civilization at its deepest level is a story it tells about itself. Not the story of its battles, not the catalogue of its kings, not even the sum of its achievements measured in cities founded and seas crossed and silver accumulated. Beneath all of that, beneath the longships and the swords and the trade routes stretching from Newfoundland to the Caspian, there is always a quieter, older thing, a set of beliefs about what the world is, what a human life is for, and what, if anything, remains when the individual life is over. This is the story that a civilization tells its children before they are old enough to understand anything else. And it is the story that, more than any other, determines the shape of everything that follows. The Norse told themselves one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of human imagination. We have touched on the great Norse myths already in earlier chapters. The world tree, the mortal gods, the shadow of Ragnarok falling across everything like a light that is also a darkness. But to end here, in the sacred world, is to understand the Viking Age not as something that happened and then finished, but as something that happened and then became permanent, worked so deeply into the fabric of the world that followed it that we move through its remnants every day without pausing to recognize what we are walking through. Consider the days of your week. Tuesday is Tyr's Day. Tyr, the one-handed god of justice and law, who sacrificed his hand so that the great wolf Fenrir could be bound and the worlds kept safe for a little longer. Wednesday is Woden's Day. Woden being the Anglo-Saxon form of Odin, the All-Father, the Seeker, the god who hung on the world tree and paid his eye for wisdom. Thursday belongs to Thor, Naya in Old Norse, the great red-bearded protector of humanity, whose hammer Mjolnir was the most beloved symbol of the Norse faithful. Friday is Frigg's Day, or in some traditions, Freya's, the goddess of love and fate and the knowledge of things to come. These names have been spoken, in various forms, every week for over 1,000 years by people who long ago forgot what they were saying. This is how myth works, not by surviving in glass cases, but by dissolving into the ordinary and becoming invisible through familiarity. The Norse mythological world did not vanish when the Norse converted to Christianity. It went underground, wove itself into language and calendar and folk tradition, and the deep grammar of Northern European storytelling. And it waited. And it is still waiting, still present, in ways that are at once trivial and profound. The Norse cosmos was, at its heart, a meditation on the relationship between knowledge and sacrifice. Odin, more than any other figure in the Norse pantheon, embodies this theme with an intensity that has no easy parallel in other mythological traditions. He is not a straightforward deity. He is not a simple war god, though he presides over battle. He is not a simple wisdom god, though wisdom is his deepest pursuit. He is, rather, a figure of relentless, self-directed suffering in the service of understanding. A god who is never satisfied, never at rest, never willing to accept the limits of what he currently knows. He gave his eye to the well of Mimir, where the roots of Yggdrasil drink from the waters of cosmic memory, in exchange for a draught of that water, a draught of genuine wisdom, the kind that sees through surfaces to the structure beneath. He hung on Yggdrasil for 9 days and 9 nights, wounded, starving, staring downward, until the runes, the letters that were also spells, the symbols that were also truths, revealed themselves to him from the darkness below. He sent his 2 ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, out across the 9 worlds every morning, and waited in anxiety for their return every evening, because the loss of either, he knew, would be a loss worse than death. To lose thought or to lose memory is to lose the self entirely. He is this ancient deity of a cold northern people, a god who understood something that feels remarkably modern, that the cost of genuine knowledge is always personal, always physical, always paid in something you cannot get back, and that this cost is worth paying. That the alternative, the comfort of not knowing, the safety of the unexamined, is a kind of voluntary blindness that no genuinely awake person can accept. The Norse people built their entire ethical framework on a version of this insight. The world is hard, and it will not become easier. Knowledge of its hardness, accepted fully and without self-deception, is the beginning of wisdom, and wisdom, applied with courage and honesty, is the closest thing to dignity that a mortal life can achieve. Ragnarok, the Norse apocalypse, is the final and most powerful expression of this framework, and it deserves to be understood on its own terms, rather than through the distorting lens of later Christian influence or modern cinematic spectacle. It was not, for the Norse, a punishment. It was not the consequence of human sin or divine anger, or any failure of faith or morality. It was simply what was going to happen. The great wolf Fenrir would break his bonds. The Midgard serpent would rise from the ocean. The fire giant Surtur would come from the south with a sword brighter than the sun. The gods would fight with everything they had, and they would lose. Odin would be swallowed, Thor would fall, the world tree would shake, the sky would burn, and then, from the waters, a new earth would rise, green and fertile, uncorrupted. The surviving gods would find each other in the ruins of Asgard and sit together in the grass and remember. The earth would be replenished. 2 human survivors. Life and life. Racer, life and life's longing, would emerge from the forest and begin again. This is an eschatology, a vision of last things, unlike almost any other in the ancient world. It is neither optimistic nor pessimistic. It holds both the destruction and the renewal in the same steady, unflinching gaze and refuses to choose between them. The universe will end. The universe will begin again. And in the interval, which is to say, in the entirety of lived existence, what matters is not whether you win. You will not ultimately win, and neither will the gods. But how you conduct yourself in the face of that certainty, with courage or with cowardice, with generosity or with smallness, with a life worth remembering or with one that leaves no trace. This is the heartbeat of the Viking Age. This is why the warriors fought the way they fought, why the explorers sailed beyond every known edge, why the traders pushed their routes into the unmapped territories of the Eastern world. Not because they expected to live forever, not because they believed the world was arranged in their favor, but because they had been given, by their stories and their gods and the dark winters of their homeland, a very clear understanding of what the alternative looked like, and they had chosen, collectively and individually, to refuse it. Christianity came to Scandinavia gradually, and with less violence than it had come to many other places. The conversion was a process that unfolded over roughly 2 centuries, from the late 9th century through to the early 11th, and it was, in most of its dimensions, a political process as much as a spiritual one. Norse kings adopted Christianity because Christianity came with a set of administrative and diplomatic advantages: access to literate clergy who could staff a royal bureaucracy, formal recognition from the great powers of Christian Europe, the legitimacy conferred by membership in the universal church, that a pagan king simply could not match. The faith spread downward from the royal courts through a combination of genuine conversion, political pressure, and the slow accumulation of Christian institutions, churches, monasteries, bishoprics, that gradually displaced the old sacred sites and the old sacred practices. But the old world did not disappear. It adapted. The Norse myths were written down, preserved paradoxically, largely by Christian Icelandic scholars of the 12th and 13th centuries who understood that these stories were worth keeping, that they constituted a literary and cultural inheritance too valuable to lose, simply because the theology they expressed was no longer current. Snorri Sturluson, the great 13th century Icelandic scholar and statesman, compiled the Prose Edda, the single most important source for Norse mythology we possess, with the explicit purpose of preserving the poetic and mythological tradition for future generations of poets and readers who might otherwise lose access to the illusions and imagery that the Old Norse skalds had built their art upon. He was a Christian man preserving a pagan world, and because of him, that world survived. The Viking Age, as a historical period, is generally considered to end in 1066, the year that contains, with a neatness that history rarely provides, 2 events that together mark the closing of an era. In September of that year, the last great Viking invasion of England was launched by Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, who had a claim to the English throne and the military confidence, born of a lifetime of Varangian service in Byzantium and warfare across the known world, to press it. He was defeated and killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire by the English king, Harold Godwinson. a battle so decisive that it effectively ended Norwegian ambitions in England forever. And then, 3 weeks later, Harold Godwinson marched his exhausted army south to face William of Normandy at Hastings, and fell there. And the Norman, the Norse, descended, French-speaking Christian Norman, became King of England, and the old world closed behind him like water over a stone. It is a remarkable ending. The Viking Age was not concluded by the defeat of the Norse. It was concluded, in a sense, by their success, by the fact that the most consequential invasion of England in the millennium was led by a man whose great-great-great-grandfather had been a Norse chieftain, camping on the banks of the Seine. The Vikings did not disappear. They transformed. They became, through the alchemy of settlement and intermarriage and cultural absorption, the Normans and the Rus and the Hiberno, Norse and the inhabitants of the Danelaw, new peoples, carrying old blood, speaking new languages, living in the countries that their ancestors had, in various ways, helped to create. What remains then? What do we take from all of this, as we sit quietly and let the last of it settle? We take, perhaps, the image of a man on a ship in the open Atlantic, 3 days out of Iceland, no land in any direction, the sky above him a low grey ceiling, and the water around him the colour of cold iron. He does not know exactly where he is. He knows approximately where he is going. He is cold and tired, and the ship moves beneath him with a living, unsettling flexibility that never quite lets you forget how thin the barrier is between you and the depth below. He watches the birds. He reads the swell. He looks at the stars when they appear, and he notes the color of the water, and he makes, from these small observations, a series of judgments that collectively amount to navigation. He is not afraid, or rather, he is afraid, in the way that all sensible people are afraid when the situation genuinely warrants it. And he has simply decided that the fear is not the most important thing. The most important thing is the horizon. What is past it? What has never been seen? What will be his to name if he can reach it? He sails on. This is who the Vikings were. Not the caricature of the horned helmet and the mindless violence. That was always a later invention, a simplification imposed by people who needed the Norse to be only one thing, and therefore manageable, therefore safely passed. The real Norse were something far more interesting, far more contradictory, far more recognizably human than the caricature allows. They were farmers and warriors, traders and explorers, poets and slavers, brilliant engineers and sincere believers in a universe that was both tragic and beautiful, and worth engaging with at full intensity for every day of the short time you were given inside it. They changed the world, not as an abstraction, not as a metaphor, but literally and permanently. In its place, names and its languages, its cities and its bloodlines, its legal traditions and its stories, and the very days of its weeks, they pushed the boundaries of the known world in every direction, until the world was larger than it had been before they arrived. And then, as all things must, they changed into something else, and the age that bore their name quietly closed, and the long memory of them began. That memory has never stopped. It is in us now, as we sit with this story, and let the last of it go quiet around us. The sound of oars on dark water, the creak of a ship's hull in a heavy swell, the rattle of a raven's wings in the high cold air above the world tree. Sea is always there, just beyond the last sentence, and on it always the ships.